have written to me asking for consideration for a sector-specific VAT reduction and the opportunity to shape the reform of business rates. Would a Treasury Minister be willing to meet with me, local providers and the Association of Indoor Play to discuss the sector's priorities?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. In terms of VAT, the Government has no plans to consider zero rating for indoor play facilities, but all tax breaks must be value for money, and evidence suggests that these savings are only partially passed on. I would, however, welcome my honourable friend engaging with us as we look to inform our Transforming Business Rates paper ahead of the budget later this year.
Shall the Chancellor of the Exchequer Melstride?
How many jobs will the Right Honourable Lady destroy as a result of her jobs tax?
No Shakespeare, Mel.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for that question. I know that he would have looked at the OBR forecast from the budget last year. They forecast that employment will rise in this Parliament, unemployment will fall and real household disposable income will increase. That's a far cry from the last Parliament, which was the worst Parliament on record for living standards.
Melstride.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady didn't reference the fact that the OBR also said that there would be 50,000 fewer jobs as a result of the next increase, and indeed Bloomberg put that figure at 130,000 jobs. It does not need to be this way, Mr. Speaker. On the 26th of March, the Right Honourable Lady should come to this House with a spring statement. She should come with a clear plan around welfare savings, which we had when we were in government. And would she now confirm that she is prepared to do that with our support and put an end to this pernicious tax increase?
What the Right Honourable Gentleman and his party had was 14 years to reform the welfare system. They failed to do so. This government will. We are turning the British economy round after the disaster left to us by the previous government. 3 cuts in interest rates since the general election. Real wages rising at their fastest rate for 3 years. Fuel duty frozen, the pay slips of working people protected, and millions getting a pay rise through an increase in the national living wage. That is the change that this government is delivering. That is the change that they're blocking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During his recent visit to Burton, His Majesty the King sampled one of Tower Brewery's excellent beers, putting our rich brewing heritage in the spotlight. Even though His Majesty and I like a tipple, low and no alcohol sales are up 610% since 2013, with a clear opportunity to support this growing sector while promoting public health. Can the Chancellor give consideration to raising the alcohol-free threshold to 0.5 ABV, in line with international markets, to improve consumer choice and growth?
Answer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He is a fantastic campaigner for the breweries in his constituency, and we want the drink sector to go from strength to strength. We are reviewing the responses to the consultation on the threshold that he mentioned.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oxfordshire has no nighttime cover for palliative care, meaning patients must dial 111 and wait hours for urgent pain relief to arrive. Will the Minister commit to increasing funding to the Department for Health and Social Care so ICBs, including the Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire and Berkshire West ICB, can deliver palliative care round the clock?
This government, as the honourable member will know, has already given £26 billion of additional funding to the National Health Service and additional funding to MHCLG for social care. We know we've got more to do. The government's working hard on that, and we'll set out further details in due course.
Whereas, Mr. Speaker, under this Labour government, Cornish tin mining is back. Following the recent wealth fund investment in South Crofty tin mine at the centre of my Campbell, Redruth and Hale constituency, does the Chancellor agree with me that in doubling the National Wealth Fund investment, this is a perfect example of how public funding should be used to unlock private investment in a strategically vital industry?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and unlike the party opposite, we believe that investing alongside private industry is good for jobs and good for economic growth. I visited the National Wealth Fund's offices last month, and I heard first-hand from them about their equity investment in Cornish metals. This will help to finance the reopening of Cornwall's South Crofty tin mine, creating more than 300 local jobs. And
Order! Look, enough is enough. I've got to get these other members in on both sides. I'm sorry that the front bench doesn't want to get the members in. I am determined to. So it is called topicals. That means it's topical. I want quick answers and certainly short answers to the question. Let's come to the Father House, Sir Edmund Lee.
Yeah. I hope I won't damage the Chancellor if I commend the fiscally conservative way she's increasing defence spending. Given that if every European country matches our 2.5% commitment, we can release over £150 billion worth of defence spending. Does she agree that we can crack this because war and peace is always won ultimately by the size of the economy?
Yeah. I very much agree with the honourable gentleman. That's why I met with fellow European finance ministers in Cape Town at the G20 last week. All of Europe needs to step up. The British government is doing so. We need to see that from other countries too.
David Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Acknowledging that ODA will go down to 0.3% of GNI in 2027, can ministers confirm whether ODA will remain at 0.5% for the calendar year of 2026, which will help ensure that UK aid keeps the maximum number of people alive for the longest possible time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Impacts on ODA budgets are currently under review by the Government. Our commitment is to prioritise legal obligations and minimise disruption, and we'll confirm details in due course. But I'll happily meet with the honourable member and colleagues to discuss this further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Expanding UK airport capacity has a very shaky case for economic benefits because business efficiency is not increasing its use of air travel, and the UK sends 3 times as many tourists out by plane as we welcome in. Could the Chancellor urgently publish her evidence for any net benefits to the economy from airport expansion so it can be carefully examined?
I think we have to decide, Mr. Speaker, whether we're for growth or against growth. This government is for growth, and we will set out further details about this particular project when the developers come forward with their plans for the government to consider.
Michelle Scroggle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous government's mismanagement has left our flood defences unfit for purpose, and this is having a huge impact on my constituents. Will the Chancellor set out what the government is doing to increase community resilience against flooding and coastal erosion?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ensure we protect the country from the devastating impacts of flooding, we've committed £2.65 billion over 24-25 to 25-26 to improve flood defences, and we've established a flood resilience task force to feed into our decisions for future spending, which will report in due course.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Mr. Speaker, Bridgewater's 77 pubs, including the Crossways Inn in West Huntsville, are at the heart of our local communities. Yet the sector overpays £500 million in business rates relative to turnover. So will the Chancellor commit to the British Beer and Pub Association's call for a 20p cut in the small business multiplier, 15p off the standard multiplier, in order to secure the future of British pubs?
Mr. Speaker, we have, of course, frozen the small business multiplier this year and will be introducing permanently lower multipliers for retail, hospitality and leisure premises from April 26, which will benefit pubs. In the meanwhile, they also benefit from our decision to increase the duty relief for draft products.
Chris Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is this government doing to ensure innovation UK tech companies like KO Park in my constituency of Harlow so it can drive economic growth as part of world-class AI computer ecosystems?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Harlow is home to one of the world's, the UK's largest supercomputers, and we're taking forward the AI Action Plan, and we've also got the Tech Adoption Review, which will look at how we can unlock the potential of our AI in our high-growth sectors.
So Oliver Dalton.
Attracting high net worth individuals to spend more time in the United Kingdom drives jobs, growth and, crucially, tax revenues. But unfortunately, the opposite is happening in the UK right now. So will the Chancellor use the spring statement to look at the statutory residence test and, in particular, the ties rules to see whether we can incentivise people to spend more time in the UK, not the other way round?
Mr. Speaker, as part of the reforms announced at the autumn budget, we are modernising the system for people from overseas spending time in the UK with a new residence-based test. We are always looking at ways to encourage people from overseas to spend time in the UK, to invest in the UK and help grow our economy.
Rachel Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate this government on the greatest level of financial sanctions that were announced last week. Does the Chancellor agree with me that keeping dirty money out of the City of London and from homes and communities across our country is vital for our national security as well as our economic stability.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and it's absolutely right that we did increase and step up the sanctions last week. Also that the loan agreement that we made with Ukraine last week, the loan will be repaid by the profits on the frozen sovereign Russian assets. Russia should pay for the damage that they have done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents is one of hundreds of people who suffered from the collapse of collateral. While the FCA has apologised to investors for failing to act faster to stop its fraudulent activities, I'm concerned that without internal changes, the FCA will make similar mistakes again. Shouldn't there be an investigation into the FCA's handling of this case?
Hear, hear.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that question. I'm very happy to meet with her and look at the case that she mentioned because I need to get more detail.
Ruth Cabri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Transport Committee has looked at the economic growth case for Heathrow expansion, and we heard conflicting evidence on the project's growth impact on regions away from London and the South East, and also on other carbon-using sectors. So will the Chancellor ask Heathrow Airport to release the full text of the Frontier Economics report on which she made her decision to expand Heathrow?
We believe, Mr. Speaker, that Heathrow as an important hub airport will have benefits for regions across the country, which Chambers of Commerce have said to us. Of course, I understand the Transport Select Committee is looking at this issue and will consider their report when they publish it in due course.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. St Ralph's Hospice in my constituency faces a £140,000 increase in staff costs due to the government's national insurance hike. This means the hospice will have to further cut staff services that take the pressure off the NHS. Will the Chancellor think again and provide an exemption for healthcare providers from the national insurance cost rise?
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor set out a budget and I've set out during the Finance Bill and related legislation exactly how we will implement the changes announced at budget. In terms of employer national insurance contributions, there are defined ways in which public sector organisations are reimbursed. They don't apply to hospices as they are largely charities or not part of the public sector directly. However, I would point him to the £100 million of extra investment which we've announced going into improving hospices.
Dr. Alison-Gunn.
Will the Minister agree with me that investment in the 5500 Midlands Growth Corridor will provide an excellent opportunity to deliver this Labour government's mission for growth and opportunity for all?
I join my honourable friend in celebrating investment into her region. Our growth mission is one where each part of the country will benefit, and we look forward to doing further work with her.
Jim Allister.
Again, protesting in Westminster today. Why is the Chancellor of the Exchequer running away from meeting the farming unions from across this nation? Why do those who feed our nation not deserve some of the Chancellor's time?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, just 2 weeks ago, I spent a fair amount of time meeting with representatives from the NFU and other representative organisations from different nations within the UK. I listened to their concerns, I listened to what they had to say. We have to be honest that we disagree. They do not agree with the government's policy, and I need to be direct about that because we had to take a number of difficult decisions at the budget, but I do not apologise for the importance of balancing the public finances and sticking to our fiscal rules.
Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next month sees a rise and an extension to the minimum wage. In Ports of North, there are 9,600 minimum wage workers, higher than the national average, leaving many in in-work poverty and many with desperate need of a boost of living standards. What steps is the government taking to help improve living standards for these low-paid workers?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Member is absolutely right that a higher minimum wage is an important way that we make low-earning workers' lives better, as is the extension we announced to sick pay yesterday, which I hope will be welcomed on all sides of this House.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The art of taxation is extracting the largest amount of money with the lowest amount of squeaking from the goose, and yet the Chancellor will have heard the honking of the tractors on Whitehall today to raise an amount of money which will only pay for less than 1 day of NHS spending. So will she commit today to reversing the family farm tax?
Mr. Speaker, as we've debated several times in this chamber and indeed in Westminster Hall, the changes we've made to agricultural property relief and business property relief retain a generous relief for people who are accessing that benefit within the taxation system. It means that people will get £1 million without any inheritance tax being due. That is in addition to the existing nil rate ban spousal transfers. Over that, it's up to an effective rate of 20%, and any money which is due can be paid over 10 years interest-free.
Luke Murphy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's recent £100 million investment into hospices, including St Michael's Hospice in Basingstoke, will help modernise facilities, enhance digital services and provide more comfortable spaces for patients and their families. Given their vital role that hospices play within all of our communities, will the Treasury continue to work with the Department of Health to ensure the sector's long-term financial stability?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question about hospices, and as he rightly points out, £100 million is being made available for hospices, £25 million in 24-25 and £75 million from April 2025. This capital funding is intended to help charitable hospices to improve and modernise their facilities and physical estate in my honourable friend's constituency and elsewhere across the country.
Tim Farrell.
Speaker, Britain is only 55% food secure. In these deeply uncertain times internationally, isn't it time to change policy when it comes to agriculture? Isn't this the day to get rid of the family farm tax and to undo the 76% cut in basic payments and invest in the people who keep us food secure?
Mr. Speaker, as I've made clear to other honourable members, the changes to agricultural property relief are a fair way to raise money which is necessary to balance the public finances. Britain has excellent food security, and that is a priority for this government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's right that the government has put more money into defence. In answer, though, to a previous question this morning, the Chief Secretary said that there is an impact assessment of the overseas development budget. Does this mean this is still in scope in the spending review and there could be changes in that budget in June?
Just to clarify, Mr. Speaker, I didn't say an impact assessment. I said the impact of the changes are being considered by the government, but we will set out the detail on that in due course.
Right, final question, Rishi Sunak.
Can I commend the government on its international leadership at this challenging time? Now, events overnight make it even clearer that Europe must find considerably more resources for Ukraine. Now, the Chancellor has rightly continued our policy of using the interest on frozen Russian state assets to benefit Ukraine. But I believe that now is the moment to go further and to actually seize those assets. Russia's invasion of Ukraine violates the principle of sovereign equality, providing a basis in international law for this, and by acting in concert with our allies, we can ensure that there are no risks to financial stability. So can I urge the Chancellor to push for coordinated action to seize those frozen Russian state assets, give that money to the Ukrainians so that they can defend their country and rebuild it too?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the right honourable gentleman for his words about this government stepping up the funding for defence. Last week we expanded sanctions on Russia, including looking at financial services. This week we've both signed off a UKEF package to provide more military support above and beyond our defence spending, as well as that loan repaid by the profits on those assets. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, we would look at going further, but as the right honourable gentleman knows, it is incredibly complicated to do that in line with international law, but we keep all options on the table because the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. Russia should pay for the damage that Russia has caused.
Right, that completes questions. Let front bench change over. We now come to the urgent question. Ellie Chance.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend, the Israeli government took the decision to block the entry of humanitarian...
Yeah, just ask the question, and then we'll come back.
I'm so sorry. To ask the Minister if she will make a statement on the situation in Gaza.
Minister.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We urge all parties to fully implement the ceasefire to help deliver a permanent end to hostilities. We're very concerned at reports that Israel is preventing humanitarian aid from entering Gaza. Israel must not block aid into Gaza. Humanitarian aid should never be contingent on a ceasefire or used as a political tool. We urge the government of Israel to lift restrictions immediately and unconditionally. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire, and a halt on goods and supplies entering Gaza risks breaching Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law. The UK is doing all we can to support this. Alongside our existing support, on 28th of January, the then Minister for Development announced a further £17 million in funding to ensure healthcare, food and shelter reaches tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure across the occupied Palestinian territories and neighbouring countries. We must all work together with the United Nations and all partners to continue to facilitate aid and ensure it is sustained. Fully reinstating commercial deliveries will be key, as will allowing more types of goods in, so that civilians who lost their homes can be protected and civilian infrastructure repaired. We welcome the announcement of an agreement to end the fighting in Gaza, and we welcome the release of 38 hostages in Gaza so far, including British national Emily Damari and Eli Sharabi, who both have close links to the UK, Emily, of course, having met the Prime Minister and discussed the dreadful treatment at the hands of Hamas. The hostages and their families have endured unimaginable suffering from the cruelty of Hamas, and the situation in Gaza has continued to worsen. The current ceasefire is the only way for the region to move forward. As we've made clear, we want to see a negotiated two-state solution with a sovereign Palestinian state, including the West Bank and Gaza, alongside a safe and secure Israel. We've also made clear that we would oppose any effort to move Palestinians in Gaza to neighbouring Arab states against their will. Forced displacements of Palestinians or any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip are simply not an option. We need Palestinian civilians to be able to return to their homes and lives and to rebuild. International law guarantees them this right. A two-state solution is the only way to secure long-term peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis. Mr. Speaker, as the Foreign Secretary said, you can hold in your heart the pain of the Israeli people and the plight of those hostages and their families, and at the same time you can hold in your heart the awful damage, pain and suffering that this has wrought in Gaza, with well over 45,000 Palestinian people having lost their lives. We must continue to focus on the future, on turning the current ceasefire deal into a political process which leads to the two-state solution, including the West Bank and Gaza.
Chance.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend, the Israeli government took the decision to block the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. The minister talked about that aid, but it can no longer be delivered. It is once again using starvation as a weapon of war. And today we hear that it has also announced a so-called hell plan that would see electricity and remaining water supplies cut off. These decisions coincide with the end of the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, with negotiations on phase 2 barely begun, jeopardising the release of the remaining live hostages, plans for a withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and a longer-term peace agreement. The UN have said international humanitarian law is clear. We must be allowed access to deliver vital, life-saving aid. Oxfam describes the move, made as Ramadan began, as a reckless act of collective punishment, explicitly prohibited under international humanitarian law. And the International Court of Justice has previously issued explicit instructions to Israel to facilitate aid deliveries to Gaza. Does the Minister agree that the Israeli government is again in clear violation of the ceasefire agreement and of international humanitarian law? Can she confirm whether she or her colleagues have spoken to their Israeli counterparts to condemn its Hell Plan, and to make clear that there must be no resumption of the war and that it is unacceptable for the people of Gaza to be denied critical food, water, medical or any other supplies. Can she tell us what action the UK will be taking against the Israeli government if it continues to illegally use humanitarian aid and access to water and power as a bargaining chip? I know she wants the ceasefire to hold. Can the Minister share her assessment of the impact of these latest developments on the prospects for a lasting, just and fair peace? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the urgent question. A halt on goods and supplies entering Gaza, such as that announced by the Government of Israel, does risk breaching obligations under international humanitarian law. And to answer her question directly, the UK government has been in touch with interlocutors to make that point. In fact, my colleague, the member for Lincoln, is in the region currently, pushing for the peace deal, and hence myself as the Indo-Pacific Minister having to cross this brief today in the House. Humanitarian aid should never be contingent on a ceasefire or used as a political tool. On the 28th of January, the then Minister for Development announced £17 million in funding to ensure healthcare, food and shelter could reach tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure across the occupied Palestinian territories. The UK has announced £129 million funding for the OPTs so far this financial year, including £41 million for UNRWA. She has asked about the long-term ceasefire prospects, and the UK plays its part in pushing both sides towards a hopeful future for the region, working not just with Arab states, but also with partners such as the US to try and push for a solution which is in line with international humanitarian law.
Dame Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I've just come back from the Middle East, where we went with the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and whilst the world watches with increasing alarm the disintegration of the peace process in Gaza, we were warned in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in the West Bank and in Israel that the far-right government in Israel may have no long-term plan when it comes to Gaza, but there is a long-term plan when it comes to the West Bank, and that is annexation. The international community is well aware of this. They see the evictions, they see the demolitions, they see the increasing numbers of Israeli settlements and the 40,000 people who have recently been displaced. In these days of hard power, what is Plan B? What is the international community going to do to stop the annexation of the West Bank? Because it won't be enough to simply condemn it once it's happened.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee and for her ongoing interest in this important matter of foreign policy, and for the work that she and her committee have done to do personal interviews and personal visits to the region. And this is all part of the supportive role which the UK must play and must take an international role in pushing for peace. On the specific question of the West Bank, the UK government has taken a very tough position on attacks by some of the militant factions or groups who are attacking Palestinians in the occupied territories in the West Bank. And we are continuing to look at measures which are available to get our message across, not just in words, but in actions. And with her permission, I will write to her as the Chair of the Select Committee to give an update on our current position in terms of our assessment of that situation.
Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
Speaker, as recent days have shown, the ceasefire continues to be incredibly fragile, and of course we all want this agreement to hold, and none of us should be in any doubt that this hinges upon the release of each and every single hostage held by Iranian-backed terrorists Hamas, who caused the conflict by their sickening acts on the 7th of October. Those hostages, as the Minister has pointed out, and their families have now suffered unimaginably for over 500 days, and this cannot go on. They've been held in barbaric conditions, and the world has been shocked by the distressing scenes surrounding those who have been released. And the Minister rightly refers to Emily Damari and others. And in Emily's case, she has shared the really awful nature of the ordeal that she experienced in Hamas captivity, and we wish her all well in her recent medical appointments that she's now receiving in the treatment. Mr. Speaker, last week we also tragically saw the distressing return of bodies of those killed under Hamas captivity, and our hearts break for their loved ones, and we mourn them and also the people of Israel. I have a series of questions for the Minister, Mr. Speaker. First of all, what role is the UK playing in helping to get an agreement on phase 2 of this ceasefire over the line? What discussions has the Foreign Secretary had with America, Israel and other regional players in recent days? What engagement has the government had in relation to the plans for the future of Gaza that have been discussed in Cairo, and how to prevent Hamas continuing to control the Gaza Strip? Secondly, what is the government's practical response on aid access? How is the government working to unblock this situation? And what is happening to the British aid that is already in the region or en route? Finally, what recent conversations has the Foreign Affairs Ministers, the Foreign Office Ministers, had with the International Committee of the Red Cross, both on their efforts on hostage release and also on humanitarian assistance more broadly?
Minister.
I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary for her emphasising of the families on both sides of this terrible conflict, but particularly the British families, of course, who the Prime Minister has met, particularly Emily Damari, the dignity and grace of the families, of all who want a home, of all who want security in the region, and of all who have been affected by this most horrendous of wars. And she evoked in her speech, in her remarks, the terrible images of hostages being released with the most macabre of pantomimes behind them. And this level of cruelty is utterly unacceptable. And the UK has made that very clear to interlocutors, both at ministerial level and at Foreign Secretary level. And of course, she talks about the role of phase 2. And there have been stops and starts in this peace process, as often there is in these very difficult situations. And what is our role? Our role is to continue to speak very closely with the US and Steve Witkoff in order to try and push for practical day-to-day solutions. She asks about British aid and what negotiations we are undertaking. We are in daily contact with the region, pushing for discussions, conversations, dialogue to push for that aid to get back in, and specifically the Red Cross, which is obviously one of our partner organisations. We will undertake, following this urgent question, to contact them with a message from this House that we want that aid to re-enter and to save lives.
Abdesam Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The powerful scenes of Palestinians celebrating the start of Ramadan, even as their homes and lives have been reduced to rubble by Israeli forces, sends a defiant message to the world that despite the displacement and destruction, Palestinians remain rooted in their land. Will the Minister confirm that the decision of blocking all aid into Gaza, collectively punishing the entire population, is a war crime and a breach of international law, contravening provisions of the Geneva Convention and the Rome Statute?
Minister.
She's quite right to point out the devastating impact of no aid getting through. And she's right to say that a halt on goods and supplies entering Gaza, such as that recently announced by the Government of Israel, does risk breaching its obligations under international humanitarian law. It's not for ministers at the dispatch box to make legal decisions or judgments, but I want to assure her that the former Minister for Development, the member for Oxford East, did pledge the £17 million to ensure healthcare, food and shelter reaching tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure. And she must reassure her constituents that the Foreign Office is doing all it can to get infrastructure across the OPTs and into Gaza in order to relieve the suffering.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Speaker, the Israeli government is wrong to prevent humanitarian aid entering Gaza. It threatens the lives of Gazans dependent on aid after the destruction of the last 15 months and is a clear breach of international humanitarian law. So what practical steps is the government taking to ensure that the Israeli government backs down and lets the aid in? I understand the depth of distress in Israel over the despicable way in which Hamas terrorists have played psychological games with the hostages and their families. Yet withholding essential supplies of food, medicine and shelter only worsens the devastation faced by the Palestinian people. In the West Bank, we also see illegal settlers violently attacking Palestinians and apparently receiving the support of members of the Israeli cabinet. So does the Minister agree with me that the UK must do all we can to undermine the extremists in this conflict so that a second phase of the ceasefire can be negotiated, all hostages released and Gazans receive the aid they desperately need?
Minister.
Could I thank the Lib Dem spokesperson for his words, and he's quite right to emphasise the psychological impact of this terrible conflict and the traumatised state that there is in the region. And as the Foreign Secretary has said, we welcome the release of the 38 hostages in Gaza, including, of course, Emily Damari, who we've already mentioned. And we think so much of the Lifshitz family, who, of course, had strong ties to the UK, held hostage by terrorists in Gaza and died. We thank Qatar, Egypt and the US for bringing their support to ensure that individuals and families' horrific ordeal can come to an end. But this is not the end, unfortunately, and that's why it's so important that we have this moment to push. He asks what we're doing practically. We're in daily contact with the region, including our mission there, and we're also obviously having these interventions which push in terms of the international debate for a just solution for both sides of this terrible conflict.
Alice Bellinger.
Last week I was in the West Bank alongside other members of the Foreign Affairs Committee on our wider trip to the Middle East. Whilst the world's attention is rightly on the devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza, we met Palestinians in the Jordan Valley whose schools were being attacked, whose mosques were being burned, and whose livestock was being stolen by extremist Israeli settlers. This is happening with the apparent connivance of the Israeli security forces, and it appears to be part of a wider plan for annexation. Could the Minister tell us what steps we are taking to protect further erosion of Palestinian land in the West Bank that will make the two-state solution even further away?
Minister.
I thank the member for his question and for his expertise in the area of aid and foreign affairs. And he's quite right to emphasise that the settlers and some of their actions, of course, there are many settler communities who just get on with it and want to see a peaceful solution. He's quite right to say that there is violence in the settlements, which are, of course, unlawful under international humanitarian law and do harm the prospect for a two-state solution. I thank him for putting on record, particularly during the holy month of Ramadan, the impact on the faith community and mosques which have been attacked. And this is certainly a point that we will ensure gets through in our next discussion with our interlocutors, both on the Israel side, but also on the Palestinian side.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, no one is surprised that as soon as the world's attention shifted from Gaza, that Israel reimposed their siege, preventing entry of all humanitarian aid. The Minister knows the impact that this will have on the beleaguered civilian population who are already suffering disease, starvation and an absence of health care. After 17 months of giving Israel carte blanche, none of us, least of all Netanyahu, expects there to be any meaningful consequence for their actions. But could she tell me, does she consider what's happening in Gaza now to be a collective punishment? And if she doesn't, what would she call it?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think sometimes the words that we use are really important, and there has been an enormous amount of suffering. And we know that for so many in Israel, they feel we don't understand their need for security. And so many in Gaza feel we don't understand the depth of their suffering. So we must redouble our efforts to communicate what we want to see, which is that two-state solution and that peaceful future for both of these communities, which must live side by side.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The leaders of the Arab world have made welcome proposals about the future of Gaza and its people. What update can the Minister give on the UK's support for those proposals? And will she join with me in particularly welcoming those proposals that they recognise that the terrorist death cult Hamas can have no future in the future governance of Gaza?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and he's quite right to say that as a proscribed terror organisation, Hamas has certainly displayed some very frightening characteristics of what we would expect a terrorist organisation to do, including the macabre pantomime which we saw over the last couple of weeks with the release of hostages, which is truly shocking. And I thank him for his question, and obviously the exact detail on the next stage of the negotiation is to be defined by the two parties, but we play a real role both with the ally, which is Israel, but also with working with Egypt and Qatar, and also with the wider region, which is why our minister right now is in the region making the point that we want to be involved, we want to be pushing for a peaceful solution, and to see that day when neither terrorism is extant and where the two communities can live side by side in peace.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to ask a question about what we were going to do if the Israelis refused to let in aid or turn on the water and power, but I think we all know basically the answer is nothing. So instead, let me ask this. The Minister quite rightly mentioned the macabre display around the return of the hostages and the condition of those hostages being returned. And she's right. She said she's taken this up with interlocutors, I think she said. But why hasn't she mentioned the return of the Palestinian non-combatants? Why hasn't she mentioned their condition when they're returning often emaciated and with signs of torture? Why hasn't she mentioned the number of senior medics who've been detained without charge and then died in mysterious circumstances in Israeli detention? Apparently there being some kind of investigation which never comes to a conclusion. And is she surprised that people have become cynical about British conduct in this conflict, when it seems that we're only concerned about the welfare of one side?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, I think we've had a very balanced approach across this House to the suffering of all the communities based in the region. And I think he is right to mention the terrible suffering of those who have experienced either arbitrary detention or who have experienced allegations of torture by various enforcement agencies. And he's also right to include this in what needs to be the next step of the negotiation around the one side of the hostages, but also those who are being released from prison. But could I also remind him that there are concerns that there might be people who shouldn't have been released, who are being released. And so all of that has to be taken in the round and balanced. And I do encourage balance and understanding about the suffering of both sides of the community and the desire for security, in the words that we use in the House.
Deputy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue of collaboration, infiltration between Hamas and some UNRWA officials is well documented. Now, clearly, people in Gaza need aid. So can the Minister update us on how we are monitoring the work being done to restore neutrality and confidence in UNRWA?
Minister.
The UK government has been a supporter of the work of UNRWA throughout this conflict and before it, and has been supporting UNRWA financially, as have all international organisations and countries. And of course, there have been problems with certain challenges to individuals who have been employed by UNRWA, but we have consistently joined with allies in expressing our concerns about the role of UNRWA being curtailed. And we urged at the UN Security Council on the 6th of November, the 11th of December, the 3rd of January, the 28th of January, the 25th of February, and in a joint statement with partners on the 27th of October, that we were urging that the important work of UNRWA can continue.
Shocker, Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The blockade of aid is just in the last line of a long-term activities that Israelis have committed against the Palestinian people. But what I would like to ask the Minister is this, that now that we have cut overseas aid to a mere 0.3% of GDP, which is the lowest in real terms in 20 years, does she still agree with the Labour Party manifesto that international aid makes the world a safer and more prosperous place? And now does she agree that with this move, the UK's historic role in the Middle East is dead and over?
Minister.
He's quite right to talk about the ongoing need for aid in the region, and the Prime Minister was very careful in his speech, both at the end of last week, and I think he's mentioned it as well since then on the press, that humanitarian aid must continue, and Gaza was specifically mentioned because it is one of our top priorities. And he's aware that the decision is only a week old to divert some of our aid spending into the defence of Europe, but he must also be aware that we will come forward with the detail of that. But could I reassure him and his constituents that Gaza was specifically mentioned in this House by the Prime Minister because it remains one of our top priorities within the Foreign Office.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that Israel has been emboldened by Trumpian tactics in imposing a total siege and blocking all supplies, including humanitarian aid into Gaza, to force new ceasefire terms. So we should be clear and call it what it is in this House: collective punishment of the Palestinian people, starvation as a method of war, and a blatant war crime. So will the Minister finally sanction Israel for these gross violations of international law?
Hear, hear, hear.
Minister.
Well, specifically on the question of sanctions, I think he knows what I'm going to say, which is we don't talk about them until we actually make a decision, and we do review any tools that we have available to us to protest. But I think we also need to understand that we're in the midst of a peace process, and we know that peace processes throughout history have stop-start elements to them. But what we are doing is we are making sure that our views, the views of this House, the view of the government, is that we must we must make sure that humanitarian aid is not prevented from entering Gaza. While this important peace process is going on, people still need to eat, they still need to have life-saving medical treatment, children still need to be educated, and that is the point that we've continued to make all the way along.
Caroline Bowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In her letter resigning as International Development Minister last week, the Right Honourable Member for Oxford East wrote that it will be impossible, given this cut's depth, to maintain the government's support for all its development commitments, and explicitly cited aid to Gaza. And at this point, I would just like to commend the Totnes Friends of Palestine for raising now £10,000 to help those in Gaza. With hospitals destroyed, a lack of clean water, desperate food shortages, and now more threats to power and water supplies, how will the Minister ensure that last week's cut to development spending will not worsen the humanitarian catastrophe that is happening in Gaza?
Minister.
Well, could I congratulate her for all the work that she does in her community to support international support and solidarity for communities in Gaza. And we know that the humanitarian situation remains extremely challenging, with over 48,000 having been killed and 90% of the population have been displaced, many repeatedly. But I think the UK has a really good story to tell. We've been in there for for decades now, and we've increased that. She mentions the outgoing Minister for Development, and of course there was a further £17 million announced on the 28th of January, so that healthcare, food and shelter could reach tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure. She asks about ongoing funding, and she's right to ask that question and hold our feet to the fire. And once we've had time to look at the coming financial years and the comprehensive spending review, she will have her answer.
That's been correct.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that Israel's decision to block aid to over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza is collective punishment, and with 80% of Gaza's health infrastructure destroyed, 1,000 medical workers killed, and the WHO estimating that 14,000 Palestinians, including 4,500 children, require urgent medical evacuation? What concrete steps have we taken to ensure that A, aid gets in, and B, those that need medical treatment have that treatment made available to them?
I thank the member for Bolton for her question and for her ongoing campaigning on humanitarian aid for Gaza. And of course, it's very positive that the Rafah crossing remains open, enabling a significant increase in the number of medical evacuations in recent weeks. It's vital that Israel ensures that there is a sustained passage for patients who need treatment not available in Gaza. Officials from across all relevant Whitehall departments are exploring avenues to ensure our support best meets the needs of the critically ill in Gaza. And the member previously on the other benches did talk about the medical staff who are under threat, and we have supported with technical advice and training, and also we announced £1 million for the Egyptian Ministry of Health and Population, delivered through the WHO Egypt, to support medically evacuated Palestinians from Gaza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Israel All-Party Group heard from the families of 5 of the remaining hostages. Of the 59 hostages still in captivity, it's estimated that only 24 are alive and 35 have been murdered. The reality is that the recently released Eli Sharabai described the conditions he was held in chains, brutally beaten and starved. The reality is that Alon Ohen, who is also alongside him, remains in captivity. The families believe that there is a very vulnerable position for all those remaining hostages. So clearly the demand has to be for all of the hostages to be released immediately, and that should be the aim of the British government. What action is the Minister taking to make sure that that happens?
Minister.
I thank the member for his question about the hostages and his ongoing support for peace in the region. And we know that the families who, of course, have the UK connection, and he specifically mentioned Ellie's family, Ellie Sharabi. The UK has played an active role in coordinating with international partners since the beginning of the conflict. The Foreign Secretary has visited Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories on 3 occasions since taking office, and has worked closely with European partners to push for a resolution to secure the ceasefire. And I have to say, I do think the situation has improved on that front in the last couple of weeks. But he's right to emphasise the return of hostages as part of that negotiated next part of the peace process. And I thank him for his question.
Frank McNally.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for updating the House on this troubling matter. This decision by the Israeli government is contrary to international humanitarian law and clearly undermines such a fragile ceasefire. Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have been absolutely clear of the right of Palestinians to return home to Gaza to rebuild their lives. So does the Minister agree with me that that right is jeopardised by the blocking of critical humanitarian aid, and what actions will the government take if that right continues to be restricted?
He's quite right to say that humanitarian aid should never be contingent on a ceasefire or used as a political tool. And we urge the government of Israel to lift restrictions immediately and unconditionally. And he asks what else this government will do. We will continue to support the peace process, to support both sides getting around the table, freeing the hostages, allowing the aid in, and having a vision for the future of this region, which is so affected by conflict and death.
Lamran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I pay tribute to the former International Development Secretary, my constituency neighbour, the Right Honourable Member for Oxford East, for her work in this area and also the wise words in her resignation letter. The Minister rightly said that forced displacement is unacceptable. Indeed, I think she mentioned that the actions of the illegal extremist settlers are unlawful. You may have seen, Mr. Speaker, at the Oscars this week, an incredible film called No Other Land, made by both Israelis and Palestinians together, highlighting the forced displacements in Masafer Yatta, won the Oscar. Now, I bet they would trade every gong going for that film to have its desired effect and for the violence to stop. We can do something. And if there was ever a time for us to ban illegal settlement goods that funds these extremist settlers, is now not the time?
Minister.
Could I thank the Honourable Lady for all of her work in the community and also in this House, educating members about not just the two sides that we always think about, but also the Christian community in Gaza as well, and in Palestine, Palestinians, Christians, who are also affected so much by the current conflict. She mentions the UK's position on settlements, and I wanted to be clear that the UK's position on settlements is they're illegal under international law, present an obstacle to peace, and threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution.
Session Loby.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many members have spoken about the importance of humanitarian aid, that vital aid to save so many lives. But what's also important are the vital aid workers who are working on the ground in really horrific conditions. Estimates show that over 320 aid workers have been killed, the highest ever on record. And yet we see so many different aid organisations being attacked on social media, saying they have links to terrorist organisations. What more can the Minister do to outline and reiterate this government's support for vital international aid organisations, including Islamic Relief, based in my constituency, who are only one of the UK's 5 NGOs certified by the core humanitarian standards, meaning they go through the most rigorous standards on their aid and transparency? What more can we do to support these vital aid workers?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for her important work in this area and for the aid organisations which are based locally just across the river. And it is true to say that aid must get to those who need it across all areas, but that the important work of aid workers must be respected and aid workers must be protected. And it's horrifying to hear reports, for example, that 6 babies have died from hypothermia and cold-related injuries in Gaza in just 2 weeks. And this is why aid organisations such as Islamic Aid, but the Red Cross and all the other organisations who make up the partnerships across the region must be able to get in to Gaza to do their important work, and also must be allowed to bring in the types of goods such as tents, medical equipment and machinery needed to support the resumption of basic services in Gaza.
Jim Shamp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for the answers to the UQ. The PM was very clear in the Chamber yesterday in his support for Ukraine until peace is achieved over the weekend, for which I am eternally grateful. But will the Minister confirm that our support remains with Israel as we attempt to secure peace for now and a lasting solution to maintain? And we hope that a future for the children on both sides of that Gaza boundary can be achieved. Thank you so much.
Minister.
I thank the honourable member for mentioning the children in this conflict, and he's very well aware of the trauma that can be passed down from generation to generation as a result, and also thinking of orphans in the region, of which there are many. And I thank him for his commitment to the State of Israel, as he says, and to a secure future for the people of Israel, so that the people of Israel can have that security which they seek, but that also an end can come to that of the suffering of people in Palestine as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In addition to my sadness and alarm about the Netanyahu government again blocking aid from entering into Gaza, I have repeatedly raised my concerns in Parliament over the years about the forced evictions and illegal settlements in the West Bank. And now, shockingly, for the first time in 2 decades, there are tanks in Janine and further displacement of Palestinians. So, Minister, what representations is the government making to the Israeli government that aid must not be blocked from entering Gaza and that this illegal occupation and further evictions must immediately be stopped?
Minister.
It gives me a further opportunity to emphasise that settlements, Israeli settlements, are illegal under international law and do harm prospects for a two-state solution. The Foreign Secretary has made it clear on a number of occasions with Israeli ministers that the government must clamp down on settler violence and end settler expansion.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for mentioning orphans, because unfortunately orphans don't have too much a voice in this place, but I'm grateful for doing so, and sadly there are too many across the world who see more and more conflict. Can I agree with my right honourable friend, the member for North West Hampshire, that civilian lives, whether they be Israeli or Palestinian, are just as precious? We should do all we can across the House to save life. But can I ask, I mean, I do have concerns. It may be a surprise, Mr. Speaker, that Ukraine may not be the biggest foreign policy headache for the government over the next coming months. And I think it may well be Israel and the divergence on Israel with the new American administration. That is of great concern. So does she accept what has been agreed in Cairo today at the Cairo Arab Summit, $53 billion 5-year reconstruction plan for Gaza, which allows displaced Palestinians to return, that we don't see a Trump Gaza Riviera, and it is countries in the region putting Palestinians back into Gaza at the heart of the future of Gaza?
Minister.
I thank the member for his question with the many aspects in it. And of course, he's aware that the majority of all homes in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. And the economy has collapsed, and delivery of basic services, including energy and water, have been badly affected. Over 60% of the electricity distribution network has been damaged or destroyed. Over 90% of main roads are damaged, profoundly limiting mobility of people, aid and goods. And that's why it's so welcome that the 53.2 billion has been underlined. And we are supportive of the regional efforts to cohere around a single, workable reconstruction plan for Gaza. And we support the region with their expertise in construction in the region to get going on that. And if I could briefly answer his question as well about the orphans. He's aware, perhaps, that the Foreign Secretary has, as one of his main areas of concern, the welfare of children, particularly children who are orphans or in need of adoption or fostering. And I will take back to him today his concern, particularly for that work stream that we do quite a lot on in the Foreign Office, and emphasise its importance.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The suffering of Palestinian children who have been attacked by Israeli drones is devastating. Yeah. And the fact that those children are denied medical support and assistance is even more devastating. Yeah. The ministers talked about how we're looking at medical evacuations, but would the minister agree with me? Actions speak louder than words. And when will enough be enough? And when will these children get the attention that they so desperately need when other countries are doing the same right now? Yeah.
She's quite right to talk about the children, and we know whether it's in Sudan, whether it is in Ukraine and everywhere else, that children suffer that deep trauma as a result of conflict. And we're deeply alarmed by the disproportionate impact of the conflict on children in Gaza. Half of Gaza's population, of course, are children, and the consequences of tens of thousands killed, injured or separated from parents, threaten not only their individual futures but the very fabric of Palestinian society for generations to come. Most, if not all, students in Gaza have not had access to education since the 7th of October, and at least 88% of school buildings will need full or major reconstruction. So she's quite right to say, what are we doing? And the UK is supporting the restoration of education services in Gaza, including through the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. And she would be aware as well of the important work to keep going to maintain the ceasefire that we've got so that we have a hope of that reconstruction dream.
Ben Lake. I'm very pleased to hear the Minister emphasise that the withholding of humanitarian aid is a direct contravention of humanitarian international law. I would also like to ask her what steps her government is taking to work with partners both in the region and in Europe to apply pressure to the Israeli government to ensure that the flow of such critical aid is no longer impeded.
Well, I thank the member for his question, and that is precisely why we have ministerial visits to the region, and in order to emphasise the importance that it is, not just to the government but to this House, that we take a message to keep pushing for that peaceful future and to keep pushing for the importance of, in the meantime, today, enough food to eat, enough water to wash and to cook, and of course to educate and to keep people healthy and safe.
Tricia Ferguson.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask my honourable friend if the government has carried out an assessment of the impact of the withdrawal of US aid from the region, and in light of any assessment that may have been carried out, is the government confident that the decision to cut international aid from our budget will not be an increasingly detrimental problem in Gaza? I understand that the Prime Minister has said that Gaza is ring-fenced, if you like, and that our humanitarian aid there will continue, but I am concerned that the withdrawal of American aid may leave a vacuum that we cannot fill.
Minister.
Could I thank her for her question? And it is true to say that over the decades, the US people, the people of the USA, have been so generous across the world in aid, including in this region. And so it's going to be almost impossible to replace the important work that USAID has done over the decades in the Middle East. However, I do not give up hope, because I think we have to keep making the case for working together internationally. A lot of the work that is done in the region is by partners working multilaterally, and so it's, yes, a part of USAID, but it's also trying to encourage other countries and countries in the region which perhaps do have more vibrant economies to step up to the plate now and to fill those gaps. Her specific question about the assessment, it's not complete because the decision is still relatively recent, as is our own decision of under a week ago. But I trust that we will come back to the House when we have more of a shape of the comprehensive spending review and how we are going to address this difficult problem.
Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the London School of Economics Middle East Centre will host the launch of a book called Understanding Hamas. One contributor to the book, Azam Tamimi, has previously called for the destruction of the State of Israel. Speakers at the event deny Hamas as a terrorist organisation and dismiss Israel wrongly as a white settler colonialist nation. Can the Minister join me in saying very clearly this is not an accurate description of Israel? There is no genocide, as unfortunately I heard a member claim earlier, and Hamas is a terrorist organisation that seeks to murder Jews and has brought nothing but destruction and disaster to the people of Gaza.
Minister.
Well, I thank him for doing his research before coming to the House, and I can confirm that Hamas is a prescribed terror organisation by our government for those very reasons. And I think it is really important that we are very robust in our defence of the right of the State of Israel to exist as our allies.
Stella, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of both Israel and Palestine have been failed
by their leadership with horrific consequences. One person who knew that more than most was my constituent's father, Oded Lifshitz, whose coffin we saw paraded horrifically through the streets of Khan Yunis. Oded, we should say his name in this place because he dedicated his life to securing peace between Israel and Palestine. He drove ambulances over the border to help Palestinian people. We can be clear in this chamber that withholding aid is wrong, using starvation as a weapon of war is wrong, but if we want to challenge their leadership, we must step up ourselves. The Minister spoke previously about what we are doing to try and support medical needs in Gaza. Can she be clear, for the avoidance of doubt, in his memory may it be a blessing, in his cause we will follow up, that we will evacuate people who need it to the UK for medical assistance from Gaza?
I thank my honourable friend, and the family have a great champion in her coming to the House and laying out in such clear terms her expectation of the government. And there have been certain schemes to assist families in medical emergencies. And with her permission, I will write to her with the exact detail and the exact guidelines which are used by the government to determine who's eligible for those schemes.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are now 60,000 known deaths in Gaza. Israel is already accused by the ICJ and ICC of war crimes and including genocidal acts, and they're now committing a new war crime in denial of food and water to the people of Gaza. What will it take for the British government to cease all arms supplies to Israel, to end the use of the RAF bases in Akrotiri as a staging point for delivery to Israel, and when will we end the security cooperation with Israel to make it absolutely clear that we're not prepared to support a regime which is breaking international humanitarian law in so many respects?
Minister.
As the member is aware, as soon as the Foreign Secretary took office, he ordered a review into the compliance with international humanitarian law of various export items. And following the review, the government suspended export licences to Israel under a number of categories and assessed that where there was a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law. On the question of genocide, as he is aware, it's not a question for the Minister to determine at the dispatch box, but of course legal experts continue to look at definitions and descriptions of acts of war and will come forward with their determinations over time.
I'm planning to run this urgent question for only about another 10 minutes, so it would be very helpful if questions could be short, please. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over recent days, we have seen the power of addressing the most challenging diplomatic, military and humanitarian crisis when coordinated action is brought together. And yet in 17 months, we have not seen a parallel when addressing the challenges over Gaza. So what action is her department taking to ensure that there is that coordinated effort? And will the Foreign Secretary call such a summit?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that suggestion, and certainly the UK will continue to work, as it has done, ceaselessly with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, the US and regional partners to build consensus for a post-conflict Gaza governance and security framework which supports conditions for a permanent and sustainable peace. And her request has been heard in the chamber.
Monica.